Your Honor, before proceeding with my closing, request permission to set up the courtroom.
Yes.
And may we use a blow-up of the state's exhibit to aid the jury during reviewing this?
Yes.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, defense counsel is ready to proceed when the court's ready.
Ready.
May it please the court. Opposing counsel. The wrong man, the wrong place, the wrong time. That's all the state has proven here today, members of the jury. You just heard from ADA McDowell, who stood before you and wanted you to focus on the evil of the crimes that took place on November 3rd. Pull out Exhibit B. Those are evil. Those are horrible images. Because this was a crime of passion. This was not a cold-blooded murder. You see, ADA McDowell wants you to focus on the evil of these crimes because he doesn't want you to focus on the state's credibility. The state has broken some promises to you today, members of the jury. At the beginning of this trial, you heard from ADA Hayward. She stood before you and told you that you would hear about how debts had been consuming Robert Duffy's life. Electric bills, gas bills, light bills. And yet, during the trial, you heard about none of it. She told you that they would present evidence about a gun because these women had been shot, that they would present evidence of a knife because the women were stabbed. And yet, you heard nothing about either of them. She told you that you would hear about all the forensic evidence tying Robert Duffy to the crime scene, and you heard nothing. All the state has proven is that they arrested the wrong man who they found at the wrong place at a wrong time their own detective never verified. Now, members of the jury, I want you to close your eyes for a moment and imagine someone falsely accused of a crime. This person is home in their apartment on a Tuesday night after a long day of work. They're watching TV on the couch. They fall asleep. It's quiet. Then suddenly, around 3 o'clock in the morning, they hear a knock on the door. They get up, answer the door, and they see a policeman there. They're standing there in their night clothes, half asleep, while that policeman tells them their two coworkers had just been brutally murdered. The police ask questions about this person's whereabouts. They don't like their answers. And this person gets arrested and charged for this particular crime. Now I ask you, how would that person defend themselves against these false allegations? How would that person convince the police that they're not guilty? How would they convince their boss? How would they convince their family? Those are the kinds of questions that Robert Duffy has had to answer for himself since November of 2009. You see, we know from the evidence in this case that he was at work at the Everything's a Dollar store that night. We know from the evidence that he left at 8:30. And we know that at some point between when he left at 8:30 and when the police came knocking on his door at 3 a.m., 2 innocent women had been gruesomely murdered. But we also know from the evidence, members of the jury, that Robert Duffy didn't do it. He's not guilty. He is the wrong man who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, the judge will instruct you that the defendant bears no burden of proof in this case, but we still made some promises to you during our opening. My co-counsel, Brittany Prescott, came before you and told you that we would point out certain deficiencies in the state's investigation. We would point out to you certain people the state should have investigated. And we've kept those promises. You heard from Robert Duffy, who testified from this witness stand under oath that he left the store that night at 8:30. That as he left, he saw Dusty Stockard, the violent ex-boyfriend of one of the victims, exiting his car and walking towards the store. And Robert Duffy also told you that when he left the store at 8:30 that night, Wendy and Krista were alive. You didn't just hear it from Robert. You also heard from Stacy Shepard, a customer in the store that night, who told you that when she left, she saw Dusty Stockard's car in the parking lot, his best friend in the passenger seat of that car, and a man with the same build and hair color as Dusty Stockard himself walking through the parking lot. You also heard from Detective Terry Glenn, the state's witness, a decorated veteran with 21 years of experience with the Armadillo Police Department. Detective Glenn sat here and told you that he never bothered to interview Dusty Stockard, never seriously investigated him. Detective Glenn also told you that he never found a gun and he never found a knife. Why do you suppose that is? Because the state had the wrong man. And they found that wrong man in the wrong place. You see, with a crime of this nature, you would expect some kind of forensic evidence to be found at the crime scene. But we don't have any of that in this case. You heard Detective Glenn admit to you that there were no fingerprints of Robert Duffy's on the store safe, even though the state wants you to believe that he took $6,000 in cash from it. You heard Detective Glenn admit to you that the store manager never reported any missing keys to the store, even though the door was locked behind Robert Duffy when he left. You heard Detective Glenn admit to you that none of Robert's blood was found at the crime scene, and none of the victim's blood was found on Robert Duffy's shoes, on Robert Duffy's clothes, in Robert Duffy's car, or in Robert Duffy's apartment. The only forensic evidence the state has is one latent middle fingerprint of Robert Duffy's on a piece of tape taken from a roll that Detective Glenn admitted to you on this stand he couldn't find any packaging for. And he couldn't find any packaging for it because he admitted to you in his own words that roll of tape was used to repair items around the store. Of course Robert Duffy's fingerprint was on it. The man was a management trainee. He did all of the jobs. But you see, Robert Duffy wasn't at the store that night when this crime took place, ladies and gentlemen. He was in the wrong place because he was at McDonald's getting a burger. And that brings me to the wrong time. 22/36/42. The state's entire case rests solely on this timestamp. Even though daylight savings time had just ended the previous day, Detective Glenn admitted to you he never verified that that time was set correctly, and this time was supposed to fall back an hour. The state wants you to believe that this video says 10:36. Videos don't lie, they tell you. Videos might not lie, but they can certainly be deceptive. Because to this tape, yeah, it was 10:36. But to Robert Duffy and to anyone else who properly set their watch, it was 9:36 when he was in the McDonald's that night, ladies and gentlemen. You see, the state's case makes absolutely no sense. They want you to believe two different and completely incompatible versions of reality. They expect you to believe that Robert Duffy bound two women by himself, killed two women by himself. And yet, they admitted to you he had no history of violence. They admitted to you he had no history of violence, but they want you to believe that he took these two lives over something as trivial as his rent. And they want you to believe that he killed these two women for his rent, stole that $6,000 for his rent, and yet they had nothing at all to say when we presented to you evidence that he already had his rent money in the form of a check from his mother and a repaid loan from his friend. The state's case makes no sense, members of the jury, and it makes no sense because they have the wrong man at the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, I want you to think back to that imaginary person I asked you to consider at the beginning. How would that person defend themselves? How could they convince people that they were not guilty. Because I'm going to tell you about Robert. Robert presented his defense to you here today. Members of the jury, Robert Duffy is calling upon you to deliver the only verdict justified by the evidence in this case. Robert Duffy is calling on you because you are the only people who can set this matter straight, who can fix this unjust predicament that he is in. And Robert Duffy needs you to pick up the phone and answer his call by returning the only verdict the state should get when they have the wrong man at the wrong place at the wrong time. Members of the jury, find Robert Duffy not guilty of robbery and not guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Thank you.